Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Muhammad Faisal or Faisal. I am the Research Fellow at the Center of Excellence for National Security, and I will be the moderator for this webinar. In relation to this topic, COVID-19 pandemic is accelerating digital transformation in various essential services such as public healthcare, public security, and education. However, it is also increasing public awareness and concerns about the risks to data security and, more importantly, privacy. A few years ago, on March 19, 2016, the Singapore News Today reported that most Singaporeans regard public security as more important than privacy. This is related to security surveillance. Fast forward to 2021, this year, the public concerns about the use of trace-together data for criminal investigations and the Education Ministry's device management application for tracking remote learning signal shifts in public attitudes on surveillance. If you recall, last month in March, a study by the Institute of Policy Studies Social Lab, IPS, found that while Singaporeans are supportive of government surveillance in public areas, they do not think it should be carried out in private situations or without their prior knowledge. Also, the study revealed that younger generations of Singaporeans are more skeptical of government surveillance. Looking ahead to the next normal, these issues will characterize the post-pandemic zeitgeist. At the national level, these concerns have implications on data-driven governance, public trust in state institutions and the political system, management of future pandemics, and Singapore's Smart Nation Drive. So today, we have three expert speakers with us to help us examine these issues and how we can address them.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Faisal, for that kind introduction. So let me start by thanking CENS for the invitation to be a part of the panel today. Very much looking forward to the conversation that we'll have. So as Faisal said, I'm a researcher with the Khazanah Research Institute in Kuala Lumpur, where we do research on pressing issues of the nation. And based on our research, we recommend policies to improve the well-being of Malaysians. As a digital sociologist, I'm currently leading a project on digital policy, which covers a number of digital inclusion and digital governance topics, including data policy. So this afternoon, I'd like to share some thoughts on the importance of data policy in navigating data-driven decision-making in the next normal. The subject of data policy is complex and wide-ranging, so what I hope to do today is to highlight a couple of points that I think will be important in figuring out how we can manage and govern the incredible amounts of data that we are working with today. So as most of us know, big data analysis and predictive algorithms are now very much a part of our daily lives, both online and offline. Complex analysis is used to predict what kind of restaurants we may want to order from so that they can be shown to us in a customized just for you recommendation on an app. Hidden biases in data, such as race, are turning out to have large predictive effects, larger than anticipated. For example, in hiring software that filters CVs and first rounds of job applications. So while data may have been first commodified by the private sector, the public sector will increasingly find data absolutely necessary to deliver good services. And so the use of data to develop digital intelligence requires good governance to ensure equitable, non-exploitative use of data for the public interest. Risks of use and abuse notwithstanding, the collection and the use of anonymized data can be useful in many policy areas. For example, location data can reveal travel patterns, indicating where traffic flow and public transportation could be improved. However, considering that data can and has been misused, there are several critical data governance questions that we need to ask in this rapidly digitalizing world. Who owns our data? Who has access to our data? How is our data being protected? What are the laws and regulations in place to govern the access, use, storage of our data? Let's start by acknowledging that data is a very broad word that covers many different types of data and information. we can conceive of public and private data, both of which can cover administrative data, operational data, transactional data, as well as analytical and statistical data, which we can typically think of as research data. This public-private distinction classifies data by funding source, whether the funds used to collect and store and analyze the data come from public funds or private funds. But I'd like to highlight that there are two other dimensions of data that overlap along this public-private line, namely personal data and behavioral surplus. Malaysia's Personal Data Protection Act defines personal data as any information that relates directly or indirectly to a data subject who is identified or identifiable from that information. So basically any information from which you can identify a person, whether it's their national ID number, their bank account information, or their health records. Behavioral surplus is a term that has been popularized by Shoshana Zuboff in her work on surveillance capitalism. It refers to data that's generated as a side product from a particular behavior. The body language, for example, of digital behavior is a way of thinking about it. For example, a person searches for a restaurant address. The search term is transactional data, but the time of the search, the type of device used, the location of the person making the search, all that is behavioral surplus. And that turns out to be extremely useful in predictive algorithms and has largely gone unregulated by governments. So we used to rely, for example, on public census data, information such as how many children live in a particular area to figure out how many schools and playgrounds need to be built in that location. Now, tech companies are finding that from the number or the time or the location of people searching for things like where to buy school uniforms or Form 3 textbooks, that can tell us a similar story with a lot more detail because it can give us additional information, for example, how much parents are willing to spend on their children's education and how much they're willing to spend on tuition and so on. So the first point I'd like to make today is this. Different types of data require different policy priorities. So for example, we should prioritize making public data open by default. Public data are collected and administered using public funds and thus should be accessible to the public for research and analysis. My colleague at KRI, Ashraf Shahuruddin, has actually written a series of papers discussing this issue, which I highly recommend, and they're all available on KRI's website. Private data, on the other hand, could reasonably be considered proprietary. So the priority there could be on allowing firms to use their marketing or their research data to improve their products and services while restricting how companies are allowed to share their customers' personal data to ensure that data monopolies do not develop and ruin competition in the market. And in fact, when it comes to personal data, most of us would be familiar with privacy concerns surrounding our own personal data. One thing I would highlight here is that, at least in Malaysia, the Personal Data Protection Act exempts government agencies from its regulations, which I believe is the case in Singapore as well. That exemption may warrant a review, especially now that we consider how contact tracing data and medical records start to be centralized in a public sector database. Currently, behavioral surplus is still mostly used and kept in the hands of the private sector. So in addition to sharing restrictions, policymakers may want to consider prioritizing limiting how much of such data can be collected and how long it can be kept. Currently, we tend to rely on a single overarching policy, for example, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, those kinds of policies to address all our varying data governance needs. But we may need to reframe the way that we think about data, not just in terms of types of data, but also in terms of the entire data value chain to make sure that our data governance is more effective. That brings me to the second point that I want to make today, that data regulation is needed all along the data value chain. At a minimum, we can think of the data value chain as starting at data generation, followed by data collection, then data storage, data access, data use, and after a certain period, data deletion. And it's worth mentioning here that data use can generate its own new data. So this allows for a loop in the chain that kickstarts another value chain. Broadly speaking, I think there are at least 5 aspects of data regulation that we can group into 2, technical aspects and procedural aspects. Two key technical aspects in terms of data regulations are data security and data interoperability. Data interoperability is about enabling data sharing by design, facilitating a data commons that allows people to combine different sets of data for different uses. And this can facilitate innovation. Data security is not just on the transactional side of things, for example, when you encrypt payment details and so on, but also on the storage end, making sure that databases are secure. We know from data breaches that the weakest link in cybersecurity is usually not the system itself, but the human users. Procedural aspects of data regulation include mission creep, data sovereignty, and data ownership, all of which are subjects of much discussion and debate, so I will very quickly just highlight them here. Mission creep occurs when data is used beyond its original intentions. On the one hand, this can improve efficiency and lead to innovation. On the other hand, it can be a breach of trust that can have discriminatory effects on different groups. For example, if you use standardized test scores in algorithms to select scholarship students, this will ignore students who did not take those standardized tests, resulting in a form of data invisibility. Data sovereignty refers to the idea that stored data should be subject to the laws and general practices of the country where it is being held. And this is especially relevant for countries that are starting to turn to cloud computing or starting to rely more on cloud computing. Should citizen data be stored outside the country and subject to another country's regulations or lack thereof? It's one thing to say that fine, administrative public data, census data and the like should be stored locally. But what about backups of emails and documents that sit on commercial servers? How should we think about cross-border data flows and digital trade? In terms of data ownership, there's also still a debate over the rights to the use of data, and particularly for economic use of data. Should these rights lie with the individual as the source of the data, or the platforms as the point of data collection, or the storage providers, or the primary analysts and economic user? Shouldn't I, the individual, get to decide who can profit off my data? But will that lead to furthering a digital divide where people who can afford to buy an app that would remove ads and other surveillance tools, would that lead to digital inequalities where groups that cannot afford to pay for those apps would have to give up their data in order to have adequate digital access? I don't think anyone has all the answers to these questions yet, but I think we certainly need to have a few more public interest technologists involved in the conversations. So with these considerations in mind, let's take a look at MySejahtera. MySejahtera is Malaysia's government-approved contact tracing app. It is also currently being used for vaccine registration and the process of tracking the vaccination rollout. And it could potentially be used as a digital vaccine certificate as well. In Malaysia, where our population is almost 33 million, there were reportedly 24.5 million downloads of MySejahtera at the end of 2020. But of course, we can't be sure if all these downloads will or have actually translated into active registered users. The official app website offers reassurances about data security, saying that data in transit are fully encrypted, while data at rest is stored in a highly secured server, and that no personal data collected by the app will be disclosed to a third party for commercial purposes. The app requires relatively minimal permissions and is actually quite transparent about behavioral surplus. The website notes that anonymized data about devices and operating systems are collected for purposes of improving the app. Upon opening the app, users will see their current status and they can check into a location. So the screenshot on the left shows a profile that has been flagged as a casual contact. This is one of 6 user classifications ranging from low risk to a confirmed case. Users can then check into a location, and all business premises in Malaysia are required to display QR scan codes at their points of entry. The original purposes of the app were for contact tracing, health self-assessments, and hotspot information, which you can see on the screenshot on the right. The app also functions as a newsfeed and a data source for information on health service providers, clinics, hospitals, and other medical information, which you can see when you tap close on the check-in screen and is indicated by the middle screenshot. However, some mission creep has set in, and the app's functions have now expanded to vaccine registration and status, and discussions for being used as a vaccine passport. On the one hand, this is efficient if indeed 24.5 million users are active and updated with the app. But it also raises a number of questions regarding inclusivity. Is it really 24.5 million? And what about the others who are not on the app or may not even have smartphones to install the app? Also, it raises questions about the governance of the increasing amounts of personal data that are being stored on the app servers. How much data does the government actually need in order to serve public health interests? And how much would be an unnecessary invasion of individual privacy? What are the policies and regulations that would need to be put into place to govern this data effectively and responsibly? I realize that's a lot more questions than answers, but I will end the presentation here and we can continue this conversation during the Q&A time. Allow me just to reiterate my thanks for this opportunity to highlight the importance of data policy. Different types of data require different policy priorities, and data regulation is needed all along the data value chain. Thank you for your attention.
Hello, everyone. So thank you very much for having me here to speak today. I'll very briefly introduce myself. So I have a background in computer engineering. My PhD was in building computer vision systems for surveillance. As I was working on that, I learned more about the ethics and privacy of camera surveillance and data generally. And so since finishing my PhD, I've gone sort of sideways more into a policy space. And the research that I've been doing more recently have been around analyzing policy responses to COVID-19 globally, as well as analyzing digital contact tracing tools. And we have a new project this year looking at public sector use of technology and algorithms, particularly in New Zealand. And so over the last year, I have spent quite a bit of time working with our Ministry of Health, looking at our digital contact tracing tool. And I'll explain what it is in a moment, but just to refresh people's memory, contact tracing is about the rapid identification of and isolation of new cases, which can then help to break the chain of transmission and limit the spread of a communicable disease. And contact tracing is an epidemiological tool that has been used for at least 100 years. But I can understand that when at the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, everybody was looking around and saying, well, what is this contact tracing task? Contact tracing is about who cases have interacted with, and where that is not possible to identify directly, where cases have been as a proxy for that. And this is very similar to many of the technology tools that we are all using every day now. Many of us will be users of Google Maps, for example, and that can effectively answer the questions that are related to contact tracing in a digital manner. So in the New Zealand context, in May, we released an app called New Zealand COVID Tracer. It is a venue-based QR code scanning app, much like Safe Entry in Singapore, particularly in the early days before the Bluetooth tokens were made available. Initially, businesses were required to have some form of contact tracing register. And what that led to was that there were 20 to 30 different providers of contact tracing register softwares. And so the government app had to compete with private offerings that also promised the same functionality. And from the official statistics that were released about participation in NZ COVID Tracer, the participation rate was very, very low. We have a population of almost 5 million, and we were having about 10 to 20,000 QR code scans a day in sort of June, July. So well below what might be necessary or even helpful for contact tracing in the event of an outbreak. What then happened was in August, we had our second wave of cases. And so this suddenly kick-started more effort in digital contact tracing. The government made the display of QR codes mandatory for all businesses. And that meant that a lot of the other providers said, okay, we should take our QR codes down because that will only confuse people. And the government moved to much more strongly encourage people to use the app. It wasn't until December when we started using the Apple-Google Bluetooth mechanism. And now we have about 1.2 million devices participating. Our adult population is about 4 million. So that translates to about 20 to 30% of the adult population participating in this tool. A couple of things to mention. So this tool is entirely voluntary, and also all of the data is decentralized. So the data is stored on the device. The only time your location or your QR code scans or the Bluetooth information is provided to the Ministry of Health is if you test positive for COVID-19 and are asked to upload that data. For everybody else who has not tested positive, the Ministry of Health has no use for that data and has therefore decided not to collect it. In terms of notifying people that they may have been in the same place as somebody who tested positive, there is an exposure notification process similar to the one that is used by Apple Google, where the Ministry of Health can publish locations and times where people who have tested positive for COVID-19 have been, and then matches are done locally on the device. And if there is a match, then the user is notified that they should go get a test. So this is a graph of the participation of Entered COVID Tracer measured by the number of QR code scans per day. The number of QR code scans per user has been relatively stable. So it has been around 1.8 to 2.3 QR code scans per user if they scan at least one QR code that day. So if, for example, you stayed at home all day and didn't scan any QR codes, then you won't appear in this. But that gives you a rough indication that the number of QR code scans is roughly proportional to the number of people who are using the app. And so you can see that we have some waves here, that there are spikes when people are using it a lot, and then it drops down when people are not using it very much. I'm just going to overlay on the Bluetooth tracing participation as well. So on the orange line is the number of devices that are participating in that Bluetooth network. And you can see that after we introduced it, the trend of that orange line follows the trend of the QR code scans reasonably closely. The main difference being that as the QR codes start to drop, the Bluetooth tracing number stays stable. And so this is because the Bluetooth system is passive, whereas the QR code system is active. It requires somebody to actively do something. Whereas with the Bluetooth system, once somebody turns it on, they probably will leave it on, and they're less likely to drop out of that network. And so the obvious question here is, why are there these spikes and falls? And there is one data source that I can overlay on top of this, which is the moments in time when there were community cases in New Zealand. So up until August, we had about 100 days with no cases of COVID-19 in the community. And then suddenly there were some cases detected in Auckland, which is the largest city in New Zealand. And that generated a lot of anxiety and concern. And actually there was a second lockdown announced with very short notice. And so that lockdown lasted a couple of weeks, but only in the main city in Auckland. The rest of the country was at what we call level 2, which is almost effectively life as normal, but with some gathering restrictions. And so we can see that there was a spike in participation as people at this point many of them were downloading and registering for the app for the first time. And as the number of QR codes became more available, as businesses were complying with the new government mandate to display a QR code. And then in around September, the outbreak was contained. There were not many new cases in the community. The number of QR code scans starts dropping. We had 2 minor scares in late 2020, where there were 1 or 2 cases that appeared. And in one case, there was a 1-day lockdown in Auckland. And in each of those cases, you see another small spike, but not in the same scale as that second lockdown. Then the QR code activity drops over Christmas and New Year's. It's summer in New Zealand. Everybody takes a holiday for 6 weeks, basically. And so mobility was lower. People were not scanning as much. Then in early 2021, we have a couple more cases. And so there was one case in Northland that was linked to somebody who had traveled back from overseas who seemed to have incubated the disease for longer than 14 days before becoming symptomatic. And that triggered a large spike in activity. And then subsequently, we had 2 shorter lockdowns in Auckland when there were more cases that appeared, which again caused a large spike in activity. And so as I'll speak to a little bit later, this really ties to changes in perception of risk. So I'll very briefly just describe this MAST framework, which is something that we've now developed to help us understand what are the barriers and drivers to participation in digital contact tracing. And this is a framework that we've borrowed from digital inclusion, which is a policy objective for every person to have equitable opportunity to participate in society using digital technologies. And so there are natural similarities between digital inclusion and digital contact tracing. And the 4 pillars of the MAST framework are motivation, access, skills, and trust. And there is a paper preprint about this that is available on arXiv for those who are interested. So motivation is a question of whether or not people want to use or want to participate in the system. And so drivers will move people towards participation, barriers will add friction and reduce participation. In COVID-19, the perceptions were the most important part of that motivation. So there are 2 things that go hand in hand. One is changes in perception of risk. As there are more cases, as there are fewer cases, people become more anxious or they become more complacent. And also changes in perception of effectiveness. So as more features are added to a tool, or as it becomes obvious that a tool is not working, people might be more likely or less likely to use a tool as well. It's important to note that these perceptions are dynamic, so they are changing over time, they are not static. Convenience and usability also is a strong influencer. If it's difficult to use, then that becomes a barrier. And we saw that with the QR codes. Even though it only takes about 5 to 10 seconds to scan into a venue, it is a little bit inconvenient. And so people choose not to do it because it's more convenient for them not to. In terms of access, this speaks to some of the digital inclusion needs around access to hardware, infrastructure, and software. Do people have access to smartphones as is required in most countries to participate in digital contact tracing? Is there sufficient infrastructure? So some countries, their tools require an active internet connection at all times in order to use the tool. And in terms of software, we have seen a variety of compatibility issues. For example, some phones are subject to the trade ban between China and the US, which means that they cannot access the Android Play Store, which has meant that they have not been able to download the app directly from the Play Store and have had to find it through other means. We've also noted some trends in the demographics between motivation and access. So we found that the elderly tend to have motivation to participate in digital contact tracing because they want to protect themselves, but they didn't necessarily have access, whereas younger people did have access, but felt that the risk to them was not great. So they did not have the motivation to participate. And the question that I have sort of posed to our government is which of these 2 is easier to influence quickly? I believe that the access barrier is more easily resolvable with money because you can at least buy hardware for people and teach them how to use it. And this is related to skills. So it's not just enough to give people a device, but we also need people to know how the system works and have the confidence to use the tool. We had some confusion around scanning QR codes in New Zealand. We had an opposition politician say that they couldn't get the app to work and therefore it was useless. We had people taking photos rather than scanning the the QR code inside the app, and so on. And all of those things can limit uptake of a tool. Also important is multilingual support. So in New Zealand, the app is still only available in English. I imagine in a place like Singapore or Malaysia, it would be very, very important to have tools that support the languages that all people are using. Lastly, I think the most important factor is trust. Do users trust the system owners? And I use this term system owners because we need to separate out the role of government and the role of corporations. I think what we have found in New Zealand is that there are lingering trust issues with Apple and Google. There has been general fear around the role of big tech. And so some people prefer not to use Bluetooth tracing because it is a protocol that is offered by Apple and Google. I think this is a factor that is difficult to influence quickly and difficult to influence in an emergency. What we found is that one-to-many advertising doesn't work very well at building trust. And we've also found that relationships are with the government as a whole. Something that I found interesting is that policymakers here have, for example, said that this community seems to have an issue with the Ministry for Social Development, but this is an app that's being made by the Ministry of Health, so therefore it should be okay. But those communities actually have a relationship with the government as a whole and don't necessarily differentiate between different agencies inside the government. There are also very long-term relationships that have to be built over time. And so, for example, talking to some of the Māori people here in New Zealand, some of them said, well, 10 years ago, we had data about us used against us by the government. And therefore, I don't trust the government now to hold on to the data related to contact tracing safely and securely. And so that is a very difficult barrier to overcome quickly. I think that you have to show good processes and commitments over time to build trust with those communities. And one thing that we are doing here is we recently released an algorithm charter in New Zealand, which is going some way towards making those sorts of commitments. I think it will be a few years before we can show that we are making progress against those commitments. So I'll have to skip that last slide, but I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have after the last speaker. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Good afternoon. I'm presenting this issue of ethics in this space of surveillance and privacy. I'm coming from the point of view of the issue of ethical dilemma. It's part of a course that I teach on ethics, and my point here is that a lot of ethical issues that people consider to be ethical issues are not really ethical issues. They are moral temptation and come to the bit. The true ethical issue is a case of a right versus a right. So in the context of what Faisal said about the minister mentioning me, it's because I felt that there were two rights that were in conflict, and this is the true ethical dilemma. And it is a very difficult decision to make. And in fact, there was consultation, and I mentioned that it's only correct that the minister couldn't sleep properly. I mean, you face a true ethical dilemma, it really gives you some major headache. And then at the national level, it gives you a supersized headache. It is a case of right versus the right. And the right that is the minister was thinking about in terms of trying to tampen down the pandemic is the right of surveillance, the right to know, the right to trace people. On the other hand, when the police used the data from Trace Together, it was the right of security. Some people talked about justice. It's also the right to use data to perhaps find somebody that you may be missing, right? So it's really two different rights at play. Often in this space for me in the media, the issue is of privacy versus freedom of expression. You tell people about things, and then you may intrude on somebody else's privacy. So it's a case of right versus right. The moral temptation is right versus wrong, and this is, in my definition, this is not an ethical dilemma. Like if the boss tells you that you better lie to the client or you'll be sacked, that's not an ethical dilemma. Because you know that's a clear wrong. To bribe or to lie, whatever, it's a clear wrong. So to me, there's not ethical dilemma. right? So I want to frame the Trace Together app in this context of right versus the right. Okay? It does make decision making a little bit harder, and I'll tell you in a bit how to resolve that. Okay, I have a poll that I use. So I had 2 questions. So I guess the administrator will run that. The first question is, are you using, and this is a Singapore context, Andrew and Rachel, sorry, so Singapore context. Well, I guess you could, Rachel and Andrew, if you are using your Trace Together, some form of that tracing app. So the first question in the poll is, are you using the Trace Together? So the first, and the second one is, would you want the police to use your neighbor's data, not your data, your neighbor's data, if it might help, solve some case, right? Using the Trace Together app, 90%, okay. Loved one, when you use it, 73%. Okay, so, okay, right, good, thank you. Yeah. So because we're short of time, I kind of condense them to 2 questions. Typically, what happens in this kind of poll is that people using the Trace Together app, they will use first of all, I mean, not everybody would want to use it, and then those who use it, they do not want the data to be used by the police. That's often the case. But when I'm asked the question that we have asked it, like, do you want the police to use not your data but a neighbor's data, right? Not your data, your neighbor's data, and it is in your interest to use a neighbor's data, then the answer typically is yes. So you can see they're quite close. The people using Trace Together, 90%. But using a neighbor data, to your credit, those of you who didn't check that, it's 73%. So there are some people who, even though it's in their interest to use a neighbor data, will not use a neighbor data, right? So I think that's sort of to your credit. I have one student, and when I asked, I posted as your child, and then he's like, okay, never mind, I won't use it, even though the data used will be would benefit me, knowing my child will be saved or helped in some way. So the point about this is that when you make the ethical decision, it must be applicable both ways, right? In other words, you have to use that same rule to apply to you as to apply to your neighbor, right? So it's a tricky one, right? The tricky one is exactly the point. And then you're being ethical, okay? All right, so we come next to the next question. Given the case of the Trace Together app being used by the police, right, how should you resolve it? If you say it's right versus right, how do you resolve it? So I think there are 2 ways to resolve it. The first way is to have a hierarchy of values. Okay, in the hierarchy of values, you place your hierarchy of values higher, higher or lower depending on your interest at a point in time, right? So should you place that issue of security over the pandemic, or do you place the pandemic over your security, right? So which is more important? These hierarchies may change over time. So possibly you could argue that at this point in time, this pandemic is more critical, affects more people. One murder on the loose, I mean, of course, touch wood doesn't come to me, right? It's one murder on the loose, but a pandemic is everybody, right? So the argument could be made that it's that the pandemic takes priority at this point in time, okay? Because in ethical decision, time plays a part as well. Or you could argue that, hey, the pandemic is less important because security is a long-term issue, right? When the pandemic will end, security issue still continues, right? So if you don't find this person or punish this person, are you not creating a moral hazard, right? So you could argue 2 ways, I guess. But the point is that you make your hierarchy of values known, your decision known, sort of ideally before you get into that situation, right? Then so you avoid having to decide with this cloud, of emotions and urgency sort of pressing over you. Okay. The other method to resolve this would be using ethical tools. Okay, and so this is the benefit of classifying the problem as an ethical problem, because there are tools to help you resolve this, right? So that's the advantage, and the tools give you the confidence that your approach is more robust, you are on the right track, you're more likely to get a good outcome. I mentioned 3 ethical principles, right? The first one is utilitarianism, right? Greatest benefit for greatest number of people. which in this case is tough to decide. I mean, which has the greatest benefit? To punish a wrongdoer for a crime, hunt for somebody, or to help tempt the pandemic, right? I mean, which has the greatest benefit, greatest number of people? How do you decide? So although we hear this term, right, utilitarianism, it's in practice it's actually quite difficult to implement. The second one is your thought experiment, your veil of ignorance. Like I mentioned in the second poll, right? You are using your neighbor's data. I didn't say use your data, right? So the point is that you don't know whose data is coming from, right? You don't know who is being affected. So you put a veil of ignorance, right? You don't know where you stand. So then you kind of decide after that, right? You don't know whether you will be a doctor, someone infected by a pandemic or not, someone a victim of someone infected, a victim of a crime, and then you come up with one principle for everybody. I know this is a kind of tutorial question that you set in tutorial for discuss about 90 minutes and then come up with it, right? But in emergency, like how do you decide these things, right? So I think this is difficult, although it's really a laudable process. Typically, this thought experiment helps the weakest, socially weakest. Okay. So I recommend for many situations Aristotle's golden mean. Okay. Now, I mean, I mentioned this in maybe I shouldn't have mentioned this, being an academic in a kind of public setting. I mentioned Aristotle's golden mean. Somebody said, "Oh, no point having an academic discussion." But actually, Aristotle's golden mean is not an academic, principle here. Okay, look at this painting here. This is School of Athens, painted by Raphael, 1509. Man at the center of the universe, okay, holding up the sky, and I want to show you two persons. So this is in the Vatican. I miss going there. I'm just nearby. I miss going there. Okay. So I want to show you. So this is called School of Athens. So all the philosophers in Athens are here. I want to highlight Socrates and Aristotle. See how Socrates is pointing to the sky. Okay, so if you look at this, Aristotle is holding the roof, right, holding up the world. So Aristotle is a theoretical guy. Sorry, Socrates is a theoretical guy. Aristotle, you see how his hands are horizontal. The book he's holding is also horizontal, right? And see how even the book, if you look at it closely, is ethics. Okay, so the Aristotle's golden mean is middle state, but it's actually practical wisdom. So although we talked about virtues being between vices, right? What he's talking about is practical wisdom. It's a creative practical wisdom and not a mathematical mean. Okay, so how do we? Okay, now you're asking this. How do you apply this to this context, right? So, of course, I have the answer. I mean, I'm a professor at NTU, right? A creative solution. Okay, so you got to think of some ways, to arrive at a solution that tries to, as far as possible, to meet both goals. In other words, to meet the goal of administering justice, apprehending the wrongdoer, finding a lost child, a victim, but also trying to tamp down the pandemic. Okay, so the creative solution for Trace Together, which is I think what the government has done, is a creative solution. Limit the use of the data in criminal investigation, right? And so they limited the use to 7 serious crimes. Okay. Another one which they didn't discuss was to limit it by time. In other words, you can use the data for a specific period and not like trace it back, keep the data forever, which is possible, but only for a specific time. Yet another one is the people have been talking about this now, and it kind of surfaced because of the pandemic. A bill of internet rights. In our Singapore case, we have no internet rights, but really internet fundamental liberties. We don't have human rights, but we have fundamental liberties. So possibly a bill of internet fundamental liberties. Okay. So on that note, I want to end and suggest to you, therefore, that, for example, in the context of the device management application, perhaps you might use a similar creative approach. Can we put the two, opposing kind of issues there? On the one hand, the schools want to trace the pupils. They want to be able to manage the devices and upload all the data at one time, right? All the applications at one time. On the other hand, parents are worried about being able to track the child, right? So can we arrive at a creative solution that meets both as far as possible? It's another time for another tutorial, right? I'll leave you on a note. Thank you.